It's my great pleasure to introduce everyone to Ambassador Addleton. I'm Bob Silverman. I'm the president of the American Foreign Service Association. We host these book notes, and I'm very pleased to offer the latest in our series, Ambassador Addleton, in his latest book on Mongolia and the United States. All of our book notes are on the YouTube, the AFSA net YouTube. We have hosted quite a few over the years, books of note to the Foreign Service and to American foreign policy more generally. So this is a great addition to that series. Ambassador Addleton, thank you for being with us today. He's a lifetime AFSA member, and you all have his bio there, and so I won't read it to you, but as you know, Ambassador Addleton spent his entire Foreign Service career outside Washington. That is quite unique. And he's served, we were trying to think where we had served together, probably somewhere in the former Soviet Union, one of his many overseas jobs. He was born and raised in Pakistan and is the author of 3 books, and I believe there are here. One of them looks like it's been translated into Russian. That's
actually Mongolian.
Mongolian, oh right, okay. Well, I won't do this introduction in Mongolian. But in any case, he met his wife Fiona, also who's here with us today, on his first tour in Islamabad. And so I'm pleased that both of their children also have won AFSA scholarships in the past. So that's it's a real Foreign Service family, the Addletons. And so, Jonathan, thank you very much for being with us today, and I look forward to your talk on Mongolia.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for that introduction, and I do appreciate the ability to participate in something like this. And of course, a lot of new faces, but honestly some very familiar faces as well. Extending back to the beginning of my aid career with Ernie, and of course Bonnie most recently in Kandahar, and Andy in Mongolia, and others as well. Sergio in Kandahar as well, my most recent assignment, and Peace Corps presence too. So thank you, and my apologies for people that I've forgotten here. What I'm going to do here is talk for about 20 minutes about the first half is kind of like how this book came about, and the second half more about the book in Mongolia. I'm actually giving a couple talks this week, and I'm trying to vary them enough so they're not the same thing every time. And you'll see, this has in some sense, more of a AFSA or Foreign Service kind of reflection. But I will talk about the book as well. Again, I have to acknowledge, even though it's a small room, a bit more nervousness than usual. Partly it's because I know people, and when you know people, you're always a bit more self-conscious. But partly because it is possible, and we can Peace Corps volunteer, Mongolians from Mongolia here, that some of the people in this room have been directly involved in some of the events in Mongolia that are described in the book. And in fact, they may have experienced some of those events firsthand that I write about secondhand. And of course, it's always a bit awkward because maybe I've gotten something wrong, or you're always waiting for that basic fact that somehow got in that was wrong. But I do appreciate that everybody was here. The reality is that as a Foreign Service officer, I was very surprised when Hong Kong University Press, I guess it was less than a year ago, said that they were interested in publishing this. I'll get into that story a little bit about how that happened. But I hadn't expected an English version. This basically came about because in 2012, it marked the 25th anniversary of US-Mongolian relations. At that time, it was my honor and privilege as an aid officer, which I think is more unusual, to serve as a U.S. ambassador in Mongolia. We knew that the 25th anniversary was coming up, and it was probably in some of those meetings we had to discuss what to do. That meeting actually became the catalyst for a number of events. One was an exhibit at the Library of Congress in 2012. Also, the National Archives of Mongolia did a very interesting exhibit where they looked through all the archives and picked out some very early indications of our relationship. It also had programs including at the Council of Foreign Relations in New York and the Mongolian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in UB. While all that was happening, I did think about wouldn't it be nice to have some kind of documented history to pass around at that 25th anniversary about our diplomatic relations. I hope to write something up, possibly involving members of our staff. One in 1918 and one in 1919, both made the case to the State Department in Washington to open an office in neither of them, I think one of them didn't get any response at all. And the second one was the wonderful example of bureaucratic obfuscation. They came back and said that, you know, they appreciated, as they always do, the correspondence, appreciated the input, but it was not deemed advisable to open an office at, quote, the present time. Well, the present time was 6 or 7 years later when we finally opened our embassy there as a result of it. And as they say, the next chapter is history. Most of the book talks about the 5 main areas of our relationship since 1987, which of course includes the diplomatic and support for democracy. It includes the development, which is diminishing fairly quickly now and replaced by a more commercial relationship. It has the security relations, and it has the people-to-people. I'm not going to go into substance on each of these, but I'll do a few little notes on some of them, and then that'll wrap up the talk if there's any kind of questions. One of the interesting things is almost every Secretary of State since James Baker has included Mongolia in their travels, which is quite remarkable when you think about it. This is a country of less than 3 million people, but most of them, you know, have visited. And in fact, President Bush visited, first American state to visit there, or first American president to visit there, and Vice President Biden visited during my time there as well. Again, Andy was, I think, that was that last trip, and then just before Andy left, he had major responsibility for Vice President Biden's visit. Baker, interestingly enough, had visited, he was there when Iraq invaded Kuwait. And because of that correspondent, or because he was there, and because of course the precedent, if you will, of a big country invading a small one next door, Mongolia was actually, I think, the first, if not the first, one of the very first to, as a country, express opposition to what happened. And what happened is Baker had to leave early, went to Moscow. He strengthened the partnership that turned into the First Gulf War, or you know, sought Russian support for a strong position against what had happened. But he promised he'd come back the next year, which he did. And so Mongolians to this day perceive Baker, who visited twice in the space of a year, as sort of having a special relationship. They also credit him with the, quote, third neighbor policy, or at least the name for it, which basically means Mongolia's foreign policy is built on good relations with its neighbors, as it should be, but also wanting to have three-dimensional relations with the rest of the world. And so that, sometimes his name is evoked in that. And when Mongolia means third neighbors, they don't just mean the United States. They mean China, they mean Korea, they mean Japan, they mean Australia, Canada, Europe, and the United States. I once made the mistake as ambassador saying to someone in the foreign ministry, well, it means good relations with the rest of the world. Actually, one of the senior foreign ministry people said, no, it's not the rest of the world, it's other democracies. And, you know, some people may say, oh, well, they're just, you know, trying to make us feel good or whatever. But the reality is that that was the way that they pitched it. It wasn't the rest of the world, but it was indeed democracies. And when you think that Mongolia last year was head of the community of democracies, that's kind of a reflection of you know, their statement about that. In terms of sort of moving on, I suppose, well, I should say my last party, literally 3 days before I left, was Secretary of State Clinton came out and spent the night, which was good because oftentimes people come for a few hours, but we had promised a bit of a break from what was her longest trip as the Secretary of State. And so right in the middle, she did, from our perspective, very nicely agree to, you know, to go out to see something of the beautiful Mongolian countryside, which she had visited as First Lady, and also knew very much about what that was about. So that was, you know, neat to have those kind of visits over time. I would say that the aid program has been modest, but really quite successful. At $10 million a year. My last year in Afghanistan, I would be at provinces and people would be complaining, oh, we're only getting $50 million from the United States. I said, you're kidding me. The province has 300,000 people, and you know, Mongolia with 3 million, 10 million a year over a 20-year period. You know, it's and what they've accomplished with that. I won't go into the details, but especially in the financial sector and some of the business development, in some areas as well, I think it's had a real measurable kind of impact. But very properly, commercial relations are coming to the fore right now, and they should be. One of the interesting things is when I first visited Mongolia in 2001, it was a $1 billion economy with a $400 million budget. If you could imagine running a country on $400 million. I mean, probably a medium-sized college in the States has a $400 million annual budget. but that's what they were doing. When I left last year, it was a $10 billion economy and a $4 billion national budget. That's a tenfold increase. Again, I said in Afghanistan that when I first arrived in Mongolia in 2001, per capita income $400 a year. That's Afghanistan. 11 years later, it's $4,000 a year. So, they have huge problems, and some skeptics have been predicting failure for 10 or 15 or 20 years now. But it may happen. I mean, it's tough. They have a tough road to go, and as I always say, the challenges for Mongolia never end. But you got to give them credit on the business side for some of that kind of growth. That has presented new commercial opportunities on our side. Caterpillar, Boeing, GE, they're all doing reasonably good business there. Our own exports, when I first arrived in Mongolia in 2001, we sold $12 million worth of stuff to Mongolia. When I left, it was more than 300 million. And even the jump from it was 40 million in 2009, and it jumped from 40 million in 2009 to 300 million last year. So those are good figures. I would still argue though that the commercial relationship between the U.S. and Mongolia is nowhere near what it should be. We did finally it was negotiated between the two countries, the transparency agreement that the United States spent so much time on, and that was good. I guess that happened very recently. Yeah, so we're happy to see that. But I think that the investment story is very much China, and when it comes to Western mining companies, frankly, it's more Australia and Canada than the United States at this point. So there's plenty of opportunity for growth in Mongolia. Another chapter covers the emergence of Mongolia as a contributor to international peacekeeping, which is a fascinating development. This is the Mongolian military numbers 12,500. The total armed services, including the police and the border guards and all that, might be 30,000. But for your military, you're drawing on an army of 12,500. The Mongolian intention is to have basically I don't know if it's called a corps or whatever it's called, but basically 2,500 soldiers that are well trained and ready to be deployed overseas. Half of them, 1,250, would be deployed at any one time. The other half would be trained in back in Mongolia. And they've done that. I think they've gotten headlines perhaps more for Iraq and Afghanistan. There's about 400 Mongolian soldiers, I think even now in Afghanistan. Certainly when I was there, it was always fun to see them when I came there because they were at Kabul Airport, they were at Camp Eggers, they were with the Germans in Kunduz. That's an interesting deployment. They were also in Iraq. But I think over the long term, the more interesting thing in many ways is the fact that they've been under the UN flag in places like Darfur. There's 800 Mongolian soldiers in South Sudan. And so when you think about their intent, if you will, to have 1,250 deployed, they're pretty much doing that right now. They've served in Darfur, South Sudan, Chad, Kosovo, Western Sahara, and any number of other places. And I think quite successfully. I mean, maybe people are, well, I don't know, when I talk to people, they really appreciate what Mongolia brings. And again, I think as a small country, it's kind of a way to make its international mark, to be part of these peacekeeping things. And I guess where we fit into it is we've been one of a number of countries that have helped in that. There's this place called Five Hills outside of Ulaanbaatar where they have training. It's sort of in Northeast Asia, the premier, maybe the only big-time UN peacekeeping training kind of venue. It's an amazing place, actually. It's a fun place to go to. But it's not just us. I mean, if you go the summer exercises involve many countries and promoting that. And I always like to say, and I've told my Chinese and Russian counterparts this, that Russia, prior to their deployment in Chad, provided the heavy equipment that the Mongolian military used. And China built the R&R spot for the Chinese military, for the Mongolian military to take their R&Rs with their families when they got back after tough duty in places like Afghanistan or Chad or South Sudan. So again, I think that in this world it can be one of those sort of positive stories of things happening. Certainly on the UN peacekeeping front, they've done that. The longest chapter is the chapter devoted to people-to-people ties. Again, Peace Corps is in here. They mentioned at the very end, talked about some of that. And I do think that the Peace Corps has made a very positive contribution to the relationship. Certainly academic cultural exchanges, to some extent a Mongolian American community here, and you've run into Mongolians in the State Department and River Place across the river and some of the hotels in here. That's just a small part of it. There's also many hundreds of Mongolian students that are studying in the United States, some of them on scholarships. We increased increase the Fulbright program, but the reality is most of them, by far the majority of them, are here on their own steam, and they're finding their way in different places. Also, I think one of the really effective ambassadors fund for cultural preservation. These are internationally competed. Mongolia has been extraordinarily successful in both small grants and a very large grant for an ambassador monastery. The book concludes with the final chapter on what the next 25 years might bring. You know, I think if you read it, you know, you'd see that I was upbeat, but it doesn't. But it also is qualified in some ways, you know, measured in terms of what can be accomplished. Again, I think the commercial relationship isn't anything like it should be. I think that for Mongolia, as I mentioned, the challenges never end. It's going to be hard. It's never going to be easy for Mongolia, and that's the way that it is. And you know, when I say upbeat, that doesn't mean that. And this has been a tough year. Those of you that follow Mongolia know it's been an extremely tough year for Mongolia for all kinds of reasons, but some of them associated with the real challenges about a resource-rich economy. You know, the Dutch disease, the need for diversification, the need to care about the environment. There's a whole list of stuff, and there's a lot of international experience that speaks to that. But again, when I say or corruption too, of course, but when I say that when the challenges never end, it just means that you move to a new place, but that place you're assailed by all kinds of other challenges too, and people that have the illusion that, and I certainly don't think this, that Mongolia ever, or any country for that matter, ever reaches the mountaintop, or if they do, they look ahead and there's a bunch of other mountains to climb, and that's the image that I try to present in this concluding chapter. Anyway, you can see that I could talk forever about Mongolia, and I appreciate your forbearance and your willingness to come, you know, to listen to it, and very gladly answer any questions anybody might have. Yes?
Well, I don't know anything about Mongolia, but I was just sort of tempted by, as you're talking about the challenges. What are the political leaders there? I mean, they admire democracy so?
Yeah,
But what's the quality of people? Are they up to it? Do they have really strategic thinkers? Do they have people? I mean, from what you said, I've come away feeling very positive. But what about that side?
Yeah, I want people to go away with a measured view, not entirely positive, but not entirely negative. In terms of the politics of the country, what's amazing is that they, I mean, again, thinking about the 25th anniversary celebration, not everybody came, but we invited all the former presidents and prime ministers for a reception on that 25th anniversary. And I thought, isn't this remarkable that you can get a gathering of former presidents and prime ministers into one room? Because you know that in many countries, there's only one surviving president or prime minister that's in the country, not in exile or whatever. Or it just happens that there's just one because these are lifetime appointments. And the fact of the matter is that Mongolia, I believe it's 6 presidential elections. They have a presidential term limit, so you know 2 terms is the maximum. They have the current president, President Addleton, is in his 2nd term. He was a student leader way back in the day and has played a prominent role in politics. I don't want to say unusually, but I think the point is that being president the 2nd time is no guarantee. And of course, you know, some people, the first day they come in, they're engineering their 2nd term. In Mongolia, incumbents tend to have a hard time because the electorate can be quite skeptical. And so some of these presidents in Mongolia have been 1-term presidents. The remarkable thing, though, it has switched between political parties. You have the Mongolian People's Party, used to be Mongolia's People's Revolutionary Party. That was the reformed Communist era party, which you know, has played a role for many years and played a post-Soviet role in Mongolian history as well. And then you have the Democratic Party and some measures of coalition, the Green Party as well. You've had, I mean, I don't want to get into too much of the detail, but you have a split. You had a split MPP last year. It does talk a bit about this. They had a former president that was arrested for corruption. It has a couple pages on that. That was a very difficult, you know, to work through. What does this mean for Mongolian democracy? And it's hard because on the one hand you have concerns over corruption and how do you deal with that, even corruption in high places. On the other hand, in many countries in the world, there's the pattern of sometimes corruption being used for other kinds of purposes. So it's not an easy kind of thing for either Mongolian political system or, frankly, its foreign well-wishers to work through, but that's been part of it too. So they've had ups and downs, but I think that, again, the fact that you have a track record, one of the things that, I hate to bring in Afghanistan, but during my last weeks there, I would sometimes say, do you realize that there were, you know, elections are coming up in that country? And people talk about it, and the world, to some extent, Afghanistan follows about it. But I said, does anybody know there was a presidential election 1 month ago in Mongolia? Did you guys know that happened in June? And the reality is that it's not in the headlines because it's normal, it's routine. It's one of those countries that has elections, and in this case, President Alvin Dortch is reelected, but in some cases, it's a new one that comes in. They had violence associated a couple elections ago, and that it wasn't big time mega, but it was a concern over the process. But again, all things considered, when you look at the span of 25 years, it's been a very interesting process. It's not just presidential elections, it's also parliamentary elections. So, on a spectrum, it's a pretty good story, and certainly on the the political system, a system that's able to accommodate change. To accommodate, I will say that I should say that one of the things it ends on is that 25 years later, Mongolia is a much more complicated place. It's a more nationalistic place, which is absolutely the case. And you need to have, I always say political systems have to accommodate change. Well, Mongolia is a country going through incredible change. And they have some real skepticism, understandably so, about mining and all kinds of things. And there's a xenophobic aspect to Mongolia like there is in any country. And I talk about that in here. And countries don't want to go there. I could say that's a statement I could make about any country anywhere in the world. But yeah, that's, that gets played out in a political kind of way too. But I think that they have had, over the past 20 years, a political system that has, been flexible, been able to accommodate that. The 90s were incredibly difficult for Mongolia. Some countries responded in different kinds of ways. Mongolia maintained its adherence to democracy. When I left the first time around as USA Mission Director, you wondered what was going to happen in this place. And the polls showed that even despite the very difficult economic circumstances, when Mongolians were asked, do you approve of the decision for democracy back in the early 90s, 90% said yes. And the second question was, or one of the other questions was, do you approve the movement toward a market economy? 80% said yes, even after difficult times. Again, the clock moves on, and Mongolia is at a different place than it was in the 2000s. Again, it's a more nationalistic place, it's a more skeptical place, and it's asking all those questions. But I still, again, nobody can predict the future, but I think that there are some grounds for giving Mongolia credit for some of the things that they have accomplished here in the 20 years. Any other questions? Yeah.
Maybe to probe beyond that particular question you just answered with the why part, and if I can say just a word, I was over the past couple of years in Mongolia a couple times, not as a Foreign Service officer, although I'm retired from the Foreign Service, but as an official of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which obviously, but maybe not everyone knows in the room, that Mongolia just joined the OSCE, and one of the things that the office I represented was very pleased about was that Mongolia did have this record of democratic development, which seemed like it might be a very good example for some of its neighbors, which had been committed to democracy and human rights for the past couple of decades without necessarily fulfilling the commitments. And one part of the question is how they did it with, as you described, very limited foreign assistance, very limited assistance from a country like the United States compared to some of its neighbors. And the second part is whether there's anything from that Mongolian path that you think might be convertible, transferable, helpful to those who are having more of a struggle with democracy, including in the OSCE region.
Right. No, I think Mongolia welcomed the OSCE engagement, and I think they do reach. I should say the third neighbors. I didn't say this, but that Mongolian diplomat said it's also the international institutions that they reach out to, and so I think OSCE is in that category. Just as a sidebar, one of my, again looking back to last year before my deployment in Afghanistan, is the foreign ministry did an OSCE. You may know this, a training session for Afghan diplomats. And it was an eye-opener. They did a fantastic job. They introduced some young diplomats to Mongolia, and landlocked country, tough neighbors. A lot of that actually resonated, and again, I was able to teach one of the sessions and have them all over the house and stuff like that. And one of the, understandably so, because of course the Mongol reputation in Afghanistan, I think you know what it is. And basically, one of the Afghan diplomats took me aside and said, you know, it's been very impressed with Mongolia. It wasn't anything like the Mongolia presented in our history books. So you can appreciate that part. I wonder about that. And of course, you know, I'm returning to Almaty and going back to aid after 2 details to state, and that will be the regional director for our programs in the 5 stans, or in Central Asia. And I was there 20 years ago. In fact, Fiona and I, 20 years ago, went to Almaty, so I have sort of a historical perspective as well. And I would say at that time, criticizing my younger self, I think we were almost condescending to Mongolia in terms of, you know, stuff was happening in Kyrgyzstan and everywhere else, and, you know, whatever. And again, when you have that spectrum, you got to give Mongolia credit. But, you know, Mongolia's on its own path. I don't know if it's different because although there was a time when Mongolia almost became the 17th Republic of the USSR, and some people will say that Trevilleson even actively lobbied for it, according to some Mongolians. But whatever the case may be, Mongolia did retain its independence. But even perhaps more than because they were, you know, part of that orbit, I think perhaps even more so is that Mongolia had a sense of identity and nationhood that survives the centuries, even when they were part of somebody else's empire, if you will. And I think so. I think that's important. When I think of the 5 stans, I think that their history of independence doesn't, or their history of being a country doesn't go back as deep. And in some sense, to retain that independence was perhaps more of a struggle for Mongolia. They, you know, the Bogd Khan people don't talk about it, but they had some Mongolians that made interesting decisions at that time that ensured that they became an independent country. And so I think that you know, may have had something to do with it. Some of the other things I can point to, because I don't necessarily always ask that question in the case of the stans. I ask it in a broader sense, and sometimes even admittedly the mining issue, is that Mongolia does have a almost universal.
Good afternoon, everybody. I don't think I need this, right? I do. Okay. Well, it may not be working anyway, so I'll just speak up. Good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to introduce everyone to Ambassador Addleton. I'm Bob Silverman. I'm the president of the American Foreign Service Association. We host these book notes, and I'm very pleased to offer the latest in our series, Ambassador Addleton, in his latest book on Mongolia and the United States. All of our book notes are on the YouTube, the AFSA net YouTube. We have hosted quite a few over the years, books of note to the Foreign Service and to American foreign policy more generally. So this is a great addition to that series. Ambassador Addleton, thank you for being with us today. He's a lifetime AFSA member, and you all have his bio there, so I won't read it to you, but as you know, Ambassador Addleton spent his entire Foreign Service career outside Washington. That is quite unique. And he's served, we were trying to think where we had served together, probably somewhere in the former Soviet Union, one of his many overseas jobs. He was born and raised in Pakistan and is the author of 3 books, and I believe they are here. One of them looks like it's been translated into Russian. That's
actually Mongolian.
Mongolian, oh right, okay. Well, I won't do this introduction in Mongolian. But in any case, he met his wife Fiona, also was here with us today, on his first tour in Islamabad. And so I'm pleased that both of their children also have won AFSA scholarships in the past. So that's it's a real Foreign Service family, the Addletons. And so, Jonathan, thank you very much for being with us today, and I look forward to your talk on Mongolia.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for that introduction, and I do appreciate the ability to participate in something like this. And of course, a lot of new faces, but honestly some very familiar faces as well. Extending back to the beginning of my aid career with Ernie, and of course Bonnie most recently in Kandahar, and Andy in Mongolia, and others as well. Sergio in Kandahar as well, my most recent assignment, and Peace Corps presence too. So thank you, and my apologies for people that I've forgotten here. What I'm going to do here is talk for about 20 minutes about the first half is kind of like how this book came about, and the second half more about the book in Mongolia. I'm actually giving a couple talks this week, and I'm trying to vary them enough so they're not the same thing every time. And you'll see this has in some sense more of a AFSA or foreign service kind of reflection. But I will talk about the book as well. Again, I have to acknowledge, even though it's a small room, a bit more nervousness than usual. Partly it's because I know people, and when you know people, you're always a bit more self-conscious. But partly because it is possible, and again, we can peace corps volunteer, Mongolians from Mongolia here, that some of the people in this room have been directly involved in some of the events in Mongolia that are described in the book. And in fact, they may have experienced some of those events firsthand that I write about secondhand. And of course, it's always a bit awkward because maybe I've gotten something wrong, or you're always waiting for that, basic fact that somehow, goddamn, that was wrong. But I do appreciate that everybody was here. The reality is that as a Foreign Service officer, I was very surprised when Hong Kong University Press, I guess it was less than a year ago, said that they were interested in publishing this. I'll get into that story a little bit about how that happened. But I hadn't expected an English version. This basically came about because in 2012, it marked the 25th anniversary of US-Mongolian relations. At that time, it was my honor and privilege as an aid officer, which I think is more unusual, to serve as a U.S. ambassador in Mongolia. We knew that the 25th anniversary was coming up, and it was probably in some of those meetings we had to discuss what to do. That meeting actually became the catalyst for a number of events. One was an exhibit at the Library of Congress in 2012. Also, the National Archives of Mongolia did a very interesting exhibit where they looked through all the archives and picked out some very early indications of our relationship. It also had programs including at the Council of Foreign Relations in New York and the Mongolian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in UB. While all that was happening, I did think about wouldn't it be nice to have some kind of documented history to pass around at that 25th anniversary about our diplomatic relations. I hope to write something up, possibly involving members of our staff, but in the end, the project became larger than I expected in terms of actually resulting in a book that was published by University Press. Of course, much of the text was written before January 2012. We knew that the anniversary was coming up, so that's when it started to be written. I did, during those years, attempt to contact all the previous U.S. ambassadors to Mongolia, and all of them but one. 6 of the 7 got back to me, and 6 of the 7 have a contribution that's reflected in the book itself. We also, because it's only a 25-year history in terms of diplomatic relations, we had staff who were there from the beginning. In fact, some of the old ambassadors had asked, so-and-so still there, whatever, and some of them were still there. We also had a tradition in that embassy of every year having an alumni dinner. I think for some of the huge embassies that might become more problematic, or as time goes on it might become more problematic, but as Fiona knows, our last year there, we had them all over to our house, and it was enough to fit around the living room in a nice kind of fashion. What happened again with the 25th anniversary, this was waiting around. I brought this because this was the Mongolian language version, which came out first. And in many ways, I thought this would be the only one, because it did come out. What's kind of nice here, of course, you have the U.S. and Mongolian flag, but if you look at it afterward, you'll see this is a picture of Abraham Lincoln sitting over there at the monument, and this is a picture of Genghis Khan sitting at his monument in Ulaanbaatar, which if you look at it, it's very similar. They're all sitting like this. And, anyway, so I didn't design the cover, but this is the way that came. The only thing in English in this is the headline. Otherwise, it's pretty much all translated to Mongolian. Again, originally I thought that if this thing ever came to fruition, it would be one of those embassy projects that the public affairs comes out with glossy little brochure or little booklet or whatever, and I thought it would be like that. But for different circumstances, it came out to be more than that. When I say more than that, this was actually published by the Jack Weatherford Foundation. I don't know if anybody's read Jack Weatherford, Genghis Khan, The Making of the Modern World, but it was for many, many weeks on the New York bestseller list. And basically, Jack, who became a friend in the past few years, taught at McAllister College in Minnesota, And he'd written a lot of books, but this one became, the bestseller that brought Genghis Khan in a very readable way home to a lot of different people. And basically, a lot of those proceeds, he established this foundation, which is supposed to promote study and knowledge of Mongolian history. And so one of those conversations, I mentioned it to him, and he said, oh, we're probably interested. So again, the Mongolian version came out a year before the English language version. And it was only after this was well on its way to being published that I wondered, well, maybe there could be an English version as well. This one too has a story of its own, which Marjorie from the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training was part of and knows about. But basically, and Andy was there as well, is the summer of 2011, we had that, that dreaded that dreaded Foreign Service moment where the OIG came out. And actually, I knew before I got there, and in fact, I actively saw it because we were overdue for an inspection. I thought we had a terrific story out there, and we wanted to do it. And so Ambassador Kenneth Brown headed the IG team. They spent a couple of weeks with us. They talked to everybody. They wrote the report, which you can see on the internet, and you can see that Andy and I and a few others more than a few others were a good team out there. And I think that was reflected there. But anyway, in their final departure meeting where they speak with the ambassador before they leave, we talked about the fact that next year the 25th anniversary was going to come up, and we talked about some of the stuff that the public affairs might do. And I said, oh, by the way, I've got this big fat manuscript that, what do you think? And he as president of ADST, was to say, oh, we might be interested. So to put a long story short, the next time I was in Washington on consultations, I went over. ADST is located at the FSI, met Marjorie for the first time, and do want to publicly thank her. Because what happens, I didn't realize this, but their Diplomats in Diplomacy series, they will actively assist if they believe it's a worthwhile project to try to place in a university press. And so we had there was a couple contacts that didn't go anywhere. But then Marjorie had worked with someone at University of Washington Press in Seattle that was now at Hong Kong University Press, and thought that they might be interested. So, that's sort of part of the story of this one as well. I did go on to Hong Kong University Press. I was there actually for the launch of that in the late spring, and the editor that we worked with, of course, is now moving on to University of Hawaii Press, I think. Or anyway, he's moving on from Hong Kong University Press.
Michael Duckworth?
Yes, Michael Duckworth. He was sort of one of the last meetings, and I have to think that it was really that connection with Marjorie and Michael Duckworth that that made this thing happen. I learned a few other things along the way. I don't know if there's other FSO writers here, but it's obvious, I guess. It's not easy for FSOs, and in particular state ambassadors, to publish anything in the Foreign Service. This manuscript required 32 clearances in the State Department. And again, I do have to publicly thank our public affairs for the fortitude and everything else they showed in that to get it through 32 different processes, most of them at the State Department, but some of them at USAID and MCC and elsewhere. I'm not sure I would have taken this on if I realized it was 32. The problem, again, this is to reflect on it, is that it took a lot longer for the clearances than for the translation. And I might say I think the translation might have suffered because of that, because we had to meet that deadline, and that had to happen. It's not easy to deal with copyright issues. I regret to say that this book does not have any photographs. It would have been nice to have some photographs of some of the early breaking of the new embassy, the early meetings with Afghans and stuff like that. But whether it's the President's office, the Vice President's office, the State Department, it's a black box. How do you get copyright? It's a shame. It's a shame because Hong Kong University Press would have gladly done photographs, but there was enough bureaucracy with this book than to try to do the photographs. And it's, when you think about it, these are public pictures, and why should it be so hard? But maybe there's a fear that some commercial benefit. I'm not sure. And then I guess the third thing is it's not easy for the U.S. government to accept free gifts. This could have been a public affairs